In that case, hello everybody. Thank you for choosing to spend your Saturday afternoon with us. Some of you were here at last year's Vibe Check, and we really appreciate that you made it to this year's Vibe Check. And we are excited to finally launch our 2023 report on online discourses of LGBTQ plus inclusion in the Philippines and share our insights with you. Alois has done a good job introducing Sin and Strat already, but I wanted to share about what it is that we aim to do at SNS in the first place. Our work is organizing and influencing narrative landscapes on social media. We study online audiences extensively, study how they talk and behave around issues and brands, and then we develop interventions to facilitate our audience's attitudinal or behavior change towards our causes and objectives. The report that we're launching today is this year's installment in our series of annual social listening reports on Filipino LGBTQ plus issues. Last year, we launched the inaugural report, which looked at 500,000 data points, and this was an independent and non-commissioned effort. It was the first social listening report of its kind to offer insights specifically on Filipino LGBTQ plus issues, insights that are difficult to access or are often not really part of the broader national demographic surveys that we see. And we released this report for free. And this year, we're really proud to continue this series. So without further ado, let's get into our findings, although I do want to give a quick content warning, as Alois mentioned earlier, that we will touch some transphobic, homophobic content today. There will be some mentions of graphic violence. So if that is particularly triggering to you, we hope it's probably best not to proceed at this point, although if you can, because this is a necessary conversation, we hope that you can also stick around. So to get into it, let's frame our report. The questions that we sought to answer are here. Where do Filipinos currently stand on key LGBTQ plus issues like SOGI, marriage equality, and hate crimes? What are the possible entry points in messaging that will aid undecided or exclusionary Filipinos towards a more inclusive attitude towards LGBTQ plus people? And what triggers online Filipino support? What triggers their hostility? You'll notice that in these questions, they're all geared towards understanding what it is that influences online Filipinos' support of LGBTQ plus inclusion in Philippine society. For us, these questions uncover how online Filipinos currently think about these issues and allow us to answer these questions with nuance and texture. If we just focus on numbers, we might be getting a view of the volume, the distribution of these conversations. But when we look at qualitative data like conversations and what specific talk points are people using when they talk about particular topics, that helps us understand how people organically talk about these things. What are the terms that they use? What are their talk points? What are the things that inspire their support or their hostility? They point us to what can be entry points that are accessible to them when it comes to motivating online Filipinos towards demonstrating support for LGBTQ plus inclusion in all aspects of life. So to answer these questions, we needed a way to articulate what inclusion looks like in all aspects of life. We developed this framework that you're seeing on the screen to verbalize these various aspects of inclusion. Our study forwards 6 dimensions of inclusion, namely visibility, health, economic well-being, education, political and civic participation, and personal security and violence. Each of these dimensions have their own indicators. Indicators of the dimension of health include SOGI inclusive health legislation and policies, SOGI sensitive healthcare, low incidence of depression among LGBTQ plus individuals, and gender affirming sexual and reproductive health and rights, among others. Indicators for the dimension of economic well-being include access to jobs, absence of workplace discrimination, adequate income relative to non-LGBTQ plus population, LGBTQ plus inclusive social security, and business climate, among others. And indicators for the dimension of education include safe learning environments, access to education, and lack of discrimination against LGBTQ plus students, and diversity inclusive school curricula. Indicators for political and civic participation include recognition and decriminalization of same-sex conduct and gender expression, existence of legal gender recognition, freedom of expression and association, political representation, and social acceptability of variations in SOGI, among others. Indicators for the personal security and violence dimension include bodily, physical, and psychological integrity, absence of laws for conversion therapy, absence of hate crimes for SOGI-related violence, legal recognition of SOGI-motivated hate crimes, and access to justice for LGBTQ plus people. I know that sounds like a lot, but I wanted to give you a picture of what each of these dimensions talk about and what each of these dimensions encapsulate, because these are the indicators to us. These are some indicators that these dimensions are included in inclusion and are also considered in our national policy. These 5 dimensions that I just mentioned are, except visibility, so the 5 out of 6 dimensions that we are using in this report, they draw from the UNDP's own proposed LGBTI inclusion index. And this index of theirs is composed of what the UNDP deems as the 5 most important dimensions for human freedom. And those were the indicators that they outlined. But for us, in SNS, we wanted to add a 6th dimension, which is visibility. This dimension, we added this because we wanted to have a more holistic and comprehensive view of LGBTQ plus experience and inclusion, especially in the Philippines. When we say visibility, what that refers to is a measurement of social acceptability of the LGBTQ plus community, but in ways outside of the traditional political arena. The dimension of visibility is indicated by the prominence of openly LGBTQ plus personalities in media and pop culture, and it's to do with media representation, pop culture phenomena, and human interest stories that introduce or present LGBTQ plus personalities to a large and presumably cisgender and heterosexual audience. We'll dive into our insights for each of these dimensions later on. Like any of our research projects, our approach to this research leverages quantitative and qualitative methodologies. For data gathering, we collected stories about LGBTQ plus issues that were published in June 2022 to May 2023. We conducted statistical analyses, word mapping, sentiment analysis, and discourse analysis on that data. And part of that analysis entailed tagging news articles gathered with the inclusion dimension that they were reporting on and that they were relevant to, and tagging the slant of the article if it was inclusive to LGBTQ plus or exclusionary to LGBTQ plus. We also tagged the comments of some of the posts that we did deep dives on. We tagged the comments in ensuing discussions for inclusive, exclusionary, or irrelevant sentiment. Then we synthesized our findings from our qualitative and quantitative analyses into the insights that you'll hear about in today's report and in today's presentation and in the report that we are just about to launch in our website. So for this study, we gathered 2,374 news articles and posts published from June 2022 to May 2023, which fetched 2.59 million engagements in total. Let's get into what we learned from all of that data. What was the narrative landscape of LGBTQ plus issues in social media in the past year? Oops. This is the graph that shows all of the stories. Each circle that you see here in this graph is a headline, and the size of the circle denotes the number of engagements that the story fetched. A quick glance at the graph tells us that most of the highly engaging stories are about LGBTQ plus celebrities. In fact, several of them throughout the year are about Vice Ganda in particular. This already quickly tells us that LGBTQ plus public figures or celebrities are online Filipinos' main entry point or exposure to LGBTQ plus discourse. Vice Ganda in particular may be, for many Filipinos, even their primary exposure to LGBTQ plus issues and experiences. Compared to policy concerns or other topics falling under any other dimension that I explained earlier, the identity and experiences of LGBTQ plus celebrities have assimilated into the mainstream. This seems to be what the general public or what our online Filipinos are most exposed to. Oops, let me just go to the next slide. Even the distribution of stories per inclusion dimension tells us as much. As you'll see here in this diagram on the right. In tagging individual stories for the inclusion dimension they were reporting on or were relevant to, we had a sample size of 331 stories, and 90.3% of those stories fell under visibility. Stories that fell under none, under political and civic participation, and under personal security and violence came next, although each of those comprised less than 5% of the sample. Stories falling under education, economic well-being, and health all accounted for less than 1% of the sample each. This distribution indicates to us that media coverage mostly focused on visibility stories, and if we want to see more significant media coverage of LGBTQ plus issues, we have outlined here the areas left to focus on, which would be the rest of the 5 of the dimensions. When we conducted sentiment analysis on the headlines, so when we were looking at their slants, if they were inclusive or exclusionary, we also saw that most stories that made for inclusive slants were visibility stories over here, comprising 82.86%. So when it comes to contributing inclusive or positive representation in media, visibility stories contribute greatly to that. Next, we put all of those 2,300 plus headlines in a word pair map to visualize the relationships between various keywords. And in doing this, these were the 5 topical clusters that we found: LGBTQ plus rights, drag pageantry, soji equality, trans empowerment, and vice ganda and Iron Perez. These signal the topics that have been influential in the narrative landscape of LGBTQ plus issues from the past year. And just to save on time a little bit, the very detailed discussions on each of these clusters can be found in the report. But what's important to note for now is that a significant part of the narrative landscape centers on visibility indicators like drag pageantry and vice ganda almost single-handedly. We also took a look at how online Filipinos were reacting to these stories. And the response to the stories was overwhelmingly positive. We were surprised to see, with the majority of reactions actually being love. 720,000 of the reactions that we were looking at were love, compared to other Facebook reactions. This is a significant shift from what we found last year, where haha, which indicates mockery, that was last year's top reaction. But here we're actually seeing that more than half of the reactions that we are dealing with were love. That indicates to us positive attitudes, but that also indicates, considering as well that most of the stories that we looked at were visibility stories, and a lot of those had to do with vice ganda. That also shows us that the vice ganda has really accounted for a lot of the goodwill there when it comes to online Filipinos' interactions with LGBTQ plus stories on social media. That is the very broad overview if we zoom out and just look at the narrative landscape that we have. But at this point, we'll also deep dive, like I said, on each of the dimensions, starting with visibility, since this was the number one and most represented dimension that we saw in the data sample that we were looking at. And the insight that really surfaced there was that longstanding cultural values like family and gender roles, these color how online Filipinos respond to LGBTQ plus personalities and their issues. For example, vice ganda and Iron Perez as surrogacy. I'm not sure if you guys got to see this when you were scrolling through Facebook, but in January 2023, vice ganda had these statements about exploring surrogacy because they want to have a child. And this would cost them 9 million pesos. This was a pretty high engaging story at 175,000 plus engagements. And when we looked at the discussions about this story and created a word pair map for it, we saw that comments were mostly inclusive and supportive, actually. And that support centered on 2 main talk points. The first being pera, as you'll see here, pretty prominent point in the map, and anak, another prominent point in the map. These were the 2 themes in the discussion. When people talked about pera, they would highlight vice ganda's agency and their ability to do whatever they want with their money. It's their choice. So people would say, it's vice ganda's 9 million pesos anyway, they can do with it what they want. And when they would talk about anak, the theme that would surface in the discussion is this notion that blood relations are important. So a lot of people empathize with vice ganda's desire to explore surrogacy to have a child, because they also agree that it's important to be related to your child in that way, through blood, biologically. Exclusionary comments mostly invoked biological reproductive functions and tended to be religiously charged. The common comments that we could think about, for example, God created man and woman, procreation is supposed to be a man and woman thing. Those were the kinds of exclusionary comments that we saw. But it's interesting to see that comments were mostly inclusive, mostly supportive of vice ganda and their desire to explore surrogacy to have a child. And the discussions here were really leveraging that traditional and cultural belief that we also have, that I'm sure maybe other people in this call have heard in their own personal experiences, that it's important to have these blood relations, or it's important to have a child because, for example, who will take care of you when you're older? Or iba talaga kung anak mo kasi yung nag-aalaga sa'yo. So those were the kinds of comments that we would see also when people would exhibit inclusive attitudes towards vice ganda's desire to explore surrogacy. Another story that fell under the visibility dimension was this story about this father who let his child dress up as a mermaid. So this story went viral. It came out in April, got about 55,000 engagements. That's really the story, is that this child dressed up as a mermaid, and the father was rather supportive of it. On the child's birthday, pinanganak kang lalaki pero pusong babae. So the father basically recognized that identity in his child and supported that expression. Oops. When we look at the word pair map of this, what we see is that 48.6% of the discourse was inclusive and supportive of the father, actually. And in articulating that support for the father, a term that we saw frequently was mabuting ama, as in the father was good for being supportive of his child's desires, and the father was good as well for demonstrating unconditional love for his child. We did see as well that 14% of the comments were exclusionary, as in people trying to say that the father was not correctly guiding his child and not correctly or not correcting that behavior that was perceived to be wrong. So from this, we can see that from the exclusionary comments, people were trying to impose these gender roles, these traditional gender roles, these long-standing cultural value of a gender role on the father's child. Let's look at these two stories side by side and see how they might even relate to each other. For example, in vice ganda surrogacy, the inclusive to LGBTQ plus talk point was that family comes first. It's important to be blood related, something that is a cultural value or something that might be a traditional belief here. Exclusionary to LGBTQ plus talk point would be that reproduction should be limited to cisgender man and woman. In the second story that we looked at, the child dressing up as a mermaid and the father being pretty supportive of it, the talk point that we saw that was inclusive to LGBTQ plus people there was that the father is a good parent. The father is supporting his child and his child's gender expression. The exclusionary sentiment there was that the father is a bad parent who is not correctly teaching his child gender roles. In both of these situations, we see that the exclusionary sentiment draws from long-standing beliefs that we have, maybe culturally ingrained beliefs that we have also to do with either gender roles or what reproduction should be and should not be, and who should be doing it and who should not be doing it. And for the inclusive sentiments, we're also seeing some adoption of those cultural values, but then expanded or adapted to be more inclusive as well. For example, the belief that family comes first and the belief that it's important to be blood related to your child. This is something of a universal value that was able to be adapted to this context. So they were actually arguing, for this inclusive experience for vice ganda to be able to explore surrogacy. They were using that value of family to say this inclusive sentiment that they had. In the case of the child dressing up as a mermaid, this is also the same universal value of a father supporting his child and a father demonstrating unconditional love for his child, but expanded to fit this context. So what we're seeing here is that this could be an opportunity using these family values, using cultural values, leveraging these universal values that we have, but making it more inclusive to the LGBTQ plus community and making it meet their experiences and actually using these universal values to push for their inclusion and social acceptability for them. So that's what we were seeing in the inclusive sentiments in these two stories, which could be a good entry point, especially now that we know that visibility stories actually take up a lot of the media landscape. Using these universal values could be a good entry point and a way to like elevate the way that we advocate for inclusive policies and inclusive sentiment. The next dimension that we're looking at is political and civic participation. And an interesting insight that we saw there is that when pro-administration politicians support LGBTQ plus causes, exclusionary online Filipinos sanction them. In public policy, when we say sanction, that means people who had been supporters explicitly say that they are now going to punish you for supporting policies that they don't support by not voting for you anymore in the next elections, and also calling for other people not do this, to not vote for you as well. So in this case, we'll get into that later, but in this case, this politician actually lost support for supporting an inclusive policy. Another big insight that we saw here is that religious codes still frame online Filipinos' views on LGBTQ plus political and civil rights. I'm sure this is something that we've all seen on anecdotally on our own, probably experienced and saw for ourselves on social media as well. But it was also very interesting to see that it's still alive and well today in 2023. Let's look first at this first story of Senator Robin Padilla. He actually in August 2022, he actually did express support for same-sex civil unions, which got about 4,200 plus engagements. This story also had an offshoot story, a development in a couple days later, like the Marawi Grand Imam also withdrew support for Senator Robin because of this specific pronouncement. When we looked at the word pair map, or when we looked at the comments of people reacting to Senator Robin's support for this policy, we saw that most responses were actually irrelevant, although implicitly homophobic. We say irrelevant because these comments were not necessarily about same-sex civil unions or not necessarily about LGBTQ plus individuals or the community at large, but they were ad hominem attacks on Senator Robin for attacks on like his intelligence, casting doubt on his Muslim faith. Some people called for him to focus on more urgent issues. So they were irrelevant to the LGBT plus community. They were not necessarily exclusionary to them, although we know implicitly that they are homophobic because this is drawing from a place where these online Filipinos believe that same-sex civil unions should not be supported. We did see, interestingly also, some presumably former supporters of the senator, they regretted their vote and called for other supporters not to vote for him. Curiously, opposition supporters did not show visible support for Senator Robin when he came out with a statement. Despite his progressive stance in this matter, no opposition or no visibly opposition supporter actually came to his defense or promoted or boosted his statements on or his support or lauded him for his support. What we're seeing here then is, one, he actually lost support from his support base, and he didn't gain support from a base that would have been supportive of same-sex civil unions as well. Another story falling under political and civic participation that got a lot of engagement actually is this other story about this LGBT couple that got married in Albay. This happened in August 2022, actually the same month that Senator Robin had those statements. And it got 13,800 plus engagements. They're a trans couple and they got married. That's why they could get married. When we looked at the discussions here, we saw that 54.4% of the comments were exclusionary. And when you look at the word pair map, the most influential clusters that we see here are God and Bible, which is pretty representative of the conversation. Discourses between those who were pro-marriage equality and anti-marriage equality were very neatly aligned with what their discourses of the God and Bible were. If they believe that the God and Bible should be the sole basis of laws surrounding marriage, then they were anti-marriage equality, and they criticized this incident. If they did not believe that the God and Bible and Christian codes in general should be the basis of laws surrounding marriage, then they were pro-marriage equality, and they celebrated this wedding that happened. That's what we saw. Not a marked change from the debates that have been surrounding marriage equality in the Philippines for a very long time. But that's also what we saw even as recently as last year. There's another cluster here that's very interesting to look at, which is this little green cluster over here, the nila, kayo, sila cluster, which because those terms are so prominent in our map, nila, kayo, sila, these are othering pronouns. These are pronouns that divide us versus them. And this cluster, if you look at the other light green nodes here, they contain binaries like karapatan and kasalanan, mali and tama, showing clear opposition in the discourse. These terms all showing up in the same cluster, what we can infer from that is that there is a kayo that's mali, there is a tayo that's tama, there's a kame that's tama, there's karapatan and there's kasalanan. There's very clear opposition here. So it's just it just illustrates to us that people are still very divided on this issue. People are still very divided on the issue of being able to grant marriage equality to LGBTQ plus couples. And when we zoom out at the broader picture of these two different stories on political and civic participation as a dimension to inclusion, we're seeing that this might be one of the areas that's particularly concerning. Not a lot of support for political and civic participation types of policies that would be inclusive to our LGBTQ plus community yet. What about the SOGI Equality Bill? So the SOGI Equality Bill is one of the landmark bills that would be so valuable for the LGBTQ plus community, but we have seen that it's just been languishing. It's been languishing at the House for the longest time, for like 20 years now. And curiously, when you look at our data, or when we looked at our data, we do still find that it does not garner the same amount of media coverage or social media engagements as any of the two stories that I mentioned just now, not Senator Robin's pronouncement and not the LGBTQ plus wedding that happened. So that points to us not necessarily a lack of interest, but definitely a lack of material to engage with is one, and two, perhaps an opportunity for media to have more coverage on policies like this, on the SOGI Equality Bill and on other LGBTQ plus legislation that should be able to facilitate more inclusion for them as well. On the dimension of economic well-being, there are no deep dives here. We did not deep dive on any particular story here because there was no story that generated enough discourse or enough discussions, enough conversations for us to really look at. But what that lack of data indicates is that highly engaging stories, the lack of highly engaging stories also means a lack of attention and a lack of discourse about this dimension, which means that there are a lot of things in the LGBTQ plus experience here in the Philippines that are not necessarily reported on yet, and that haven't reached mainstream attention. So earlier, when I was talking about the framework that we're using, when we talk about economic well-being, we're talking about workplace discrimination, job opportunities. So we're talking about income disparities between like LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ populations. We don't have stories on these things. We don't have stories about what the economic experience of LGBTQ plus community is, which leaves a very big blind spot, considering that this is a very important dimension to inclusion that is not being talked about necessarily in media and not reaching mainstream consciousness yet. So a big blind spot, this particular dimension. The next dimension that we looked at is personal security and violence. And the big insight really here is that heinous crimes inspire sympathy for the LGBTQ plus community, but there's no mainstream awareness, again, of gender-based violence. And in talking about this dimension, we'll show you a spectrum ranging from a very dire situation, an actual a hate crime that really led to death, and then another story that's more about day-to-day discriminations or microaggressions. One story that we saw, and this was a local story covered by Sunstar Cebu. So this happened in Cebu. A lesbian, or according to the headline, a tomboy, was found dead in Bogo. This was a story that came out in November 2022, and it fetched about 2,700 plus engagements. When we looked at the comments here, it was interesting for us to note that discussion was primarily neutral. 42.1% of the comments were neutral, not inclusive, not exclusionary, but they were neutral because they expressed condolences. They were mostly people sharing, feeling sympathy for the victim, and also expressing their own condolences. There were also some irrelevant comments. At more than a third of the comments were irrelevant, and they were irrelevant in the sense that they were advocating for the death penalty and referencing lower crime rates during the previous administration. So things that were not necessarily about the victim or about the nature of the hate crime that happened to her. That happened to them. That call for reinstating death penalty is not necessarily aligned with human rights. So that it also shows to us that there is an attitude there that is not necessarily inclusive or progressive yet, or does not promote human rights yet. Curiously, though, when you look at this discussion and when you look at the comments, there's no mention of this incident as a hate crime. So the dimension of this incident, or even discussions about if this was Soji motivated or if this was related to their gender identity, if it was a specific hate crime of that sort, that did not enter mainstream the mainstream discussions about this story. On the other side of the spectrum of violence that our LGBTQ plus community can experience, there was this other story that came out in October 2022 of a trans woman who was not allowed to use female dressing rooms in a retail store in Bonifacio Global City. She posted a video of herself crying because she was recounting the story of discrimination that she felt. The staff of the store were not allowing her to use the female dressing rooms because she is, in their words, still a man. When we looked at the comments here, it was interesting to see that the discussion was primarily exclusionary. Actually, exclusionary comments accounted for 12 times more than inclusive comments. And when we looked at the exclusionary comments, the themes in the discussions would be like the trans woman or the trans women in general need to follow rules that establishment set. There's another theme in the discussion that's, being a trans is a choice. So you should know that some people are not supportive of that, and you should adjust to their rules. And you should know that you're not going to be accepted in all public spaces. So you should just follow the expectations of these establishments. Another theme in the discussion was gender essentialism, people insisting that gender should be reduced to what genitals you have, and people who promoted gender binary, like there's only man and there's only woman. In this case, although we as advocates, we know that this is part of violence, this is a microaggression, this is part of the Soji-based violences that the community faces on the day-to-day. Although it did not result in murder, it did not result in death like the previous example did. Here, people were not so quick to sympathize. People were actually pretty exclusionary. Excuse me. People were pretty exclusionary in their reactions to this story. Oops. Excuse me. Some examples of the comments that we saw here is specifically in responses to the story of the trans woman who wasn't allowed to use the female dressing rooms. Oh, I guess we are dropping names. Been to different branches, and literally may mga trans din ako na nakasabay sa women's fitting rooms there. And they were talking about how you should just let them use the women's fitting room. They are women. someone else commented that, what is the purpose of having gender in society as a subject in school anyway, if there are still going to be close-minded people outside? Some comments that were exclusionary in sentiment are, one, there's only two genders. Dalawa lang ang gender kahit birth and death certificate. The other comment that we have here as an example is that did God create transgender or gays? God only created man and woman. So when you look at the discussions, there are people who are supportive. There are people who are pushing for trans women to, be allowed to use the dressing rooms that they want to use, but there are also still exclusionary online Filipinos that tend to just perpetuate those same talk points that we've heard as common arguments against trans people. Now, when it comes to health as a dimension, concerning thing that we saw that is that despite an increase in HIV cases in the Philippines, as in cases of HIV positive people in the Philippines, coverage in media remained pretty minimal. In fact, the only story that we did that we could do a deep dive on that fell under this dimension was this particular AFP story on LGBTQ confronts monkeypox stigma. So this was actually an international article that gained traction in the Philippines as well. It was published in July 2022, and it's basically about how the LGBTQ plus community had been blamed for like the monkeypox outbreak, and they're now having to deal with trying to show people that it's not their fault. When we looked at the sentiments that sprouted from discussions of this issue, we saw that exclusionary comments took up 31.7%, almost a third of the comments. And these comments also mostly blamed the community for spreading the disease. Some people would say things like they deserve it, or they took on a tone of like, I told you so, indicating that there's really a lack of empathy there. Of course, there were some people who still defended the LGBTQ plus community and said that anyone can be a carrier of the virus. It has nothing to do with being LGBTQ. And some people calling out that that stigma is explicitly homophobic. But there are other people who had exclusionary sentiments that were, again, just saying the things that we expect from exclusionary sentiments, things like God only made man and women, kaya ipinagbawal ng Panginoon yan kasi may resulta na hindi maganda. But all of this indicates a lack of sympathy for the community, and two, like a dismissal of doubt that maybe the LGBTQ plus community did not cause monkeypox, maybe they did not spread monkeypox, maybe it's something else entirely. Like these online Filipinos with exclusionary attitudes, they were so quick and ready to accept the belief that the community did spread and cause the outbreak of monkeypox. Lastly, this is the last dimension that we're talking about, which is education. Decisions to allow students to dress according to their soji was met with mixed reactions. There were actually two similar stories under this dimension, and both of them were about uniform. Both of them were about trans women students being allowed to wear the uniform or the toga that matched their gender identity, or that accurately followed the gender expression that they wanted to show. But let's deep dive into one of them, which is that the trans teen was allowed to wear the female uniform to her high school. Story that came out in September 2022 got about over 63,000 engagements. And trans teen na pinayagang mag-uniforming pambabae nagpasalamat. So basically the story was about how she was thanking the school. When we looked at the sentiments here, we saw that 38.6% were inclusive and 34.5% were exclusionary. So cutting it kind of close, which means that there's some division in this topic. People who were inclusive, or online Filipinos who had inclusive attitudes towards this, they would say things like, it's good that the school supports the expression of the trans teen, and said that the student is pretty, looks good in her uniform. Exclusionary sentiments here, though, mostly revolved around how the school shouldn't allow students to be so entitled and should still be teaching what's right and wrong to their students, implicitly saying that dressing this way is wrong. When you look at the word pair map for the stories, when you look at how the conversations around the stories were organized, we see that school and babae is pretty features pretty prominently in our map, and that the discussion there was really about the school's decision to allow trans female students to wear female uniforms. Basically, when you look at the discourse of people who were mentioning these terms, it was about, they were talking about their perspective of how schools should teach what is right to their students, and instead of just letting them do what they want to do, letting them be happy if what makes them happy is morally bad, according to these comments. There was also a part of the conversation that was a bit of a tangent, but was basically about how trans students should have their own bathroom as well, indicating to us that there is still a view of trans as other. There were other keywords here like nila, and which was frequently used with karapatan, which tells us that there were online Filipinos demonstrating that inclusive attitude, that students should have the right to dress according to their gender expression. When we looked at each the deep dives that we did on each of these dimensions, those were the insights that we had. And in looking at that narrative landscape, like the broad narrative landscape and even the narrative landscape per dimension, these were the recommendations that we came up with. And we have different recommendations for three different sets of people. So policymakers, media, and also advocacy organizations. Starting with policymakers, one, we think it would be good to establish an advisory body that's specific to LGBTQ plus concerns, so that their concerns are more reflected in policy, in proposed policy, in like the legislative efforts that we have. We think that it would also be a good idea to organize an annual LGBTQ plus policy forum. As you saw, discussions about SOGI or the SOGI Equality Bill are pretty minimal. And the bill itself has been languishing in the House for decades now. So I think it would be good to have like this. We think it would be good to have this initiative where we could talk about what policies are needed and how can we promote these more. Next, supporting free and easy access to resources on LGBTQ plus issues. It will also be valuable. It will help policymakers propose policies that will be more that addresses the needs on the ground, but it also helps the Filipino population at large know what the actual issues are. Since a lot of the dimensions of inclusion are actually underreported and not really covered in media, it would be good if we had more resources focused on actually promoting those things or amplifying these concerns and amplifying the experiences of LGBTQ plus Filipinos. Next, an increase. We think it would be a good idea to increase comms on SOGI and anti-discrimination and on gender-based violence in particular. As you saw, online Filipinos and maybe Filipinos at large still have this impression that when a heinous crime happens to an LGBTQ plus individual, it tends to be an isolated incident. Although we as advocates know that these are not isolated incidents, they're all symptoms of the same issue of violence of the violence that the LGBTQ plus community faces. That pattern is not established for many Filipinos, so it might be good to surface that experience that the community faces, that unique violence that the community faces. When it comes to SOGI and anti-discrimination, policymakers could probably promote their efforts there more and talk more about what are the initiatives or projects or policy programs they have in place to address concerns under these particular topics for the LGBTQ plus community. For media, some things that we see can be done are improving coverage of policy issues and gender-based violence, maybe also trying to work at drawing that connection between these isolated incidents of violence against LGBTQ plus individuals. Another thing is to promote inclusive curriculum in journalism schools and training, maybe more training on what language should be used, a standardized language to be used to be more, to represent different gender identities more accurately, and to collaborate on an editorial calendar that can facilitate widespread coverage on very urgent issues. For example, despite rising incidences of HIV in the Philippines, it's not really talked about as well. For advocates and organizations, the main recommendations that we have there are to direct resources to projects that support trans people and that protect trans rights. In our research, even from last year's research, we are seeing that trans people in particular are vulnerable to hostility or vulnerable to violence. And so we think that it's really the trans community that needs the most support at this time. Another thing we can do is to amplify policy issues and concerns falling under the undercovered dimensions, or the dimensions that didn't receive as much coverage. And next, we also have to work to establish patterns in society's treatment of LGBTQ plus individuals. Like I was talking about earlier, for many online Filipinos, the thread, especially those who are not yet initiated in LGBTQ plus discourse or issues or advocacy, they're not really conscious yet that these incidents are all related and they're all symptomatic of a systemic problem that we have when it comes to transphobia or homophobia. Even the fact that some hate crimes are soji motivated or related or really gender-based violence, it's not even talked about in media or not even talked about in mainstream discussions as well. So that's also something that advocates and organizations can work to create buzz around or to amplify. So that recognition also helps our other Filipinos be more empathetic to our LGBTQ plus community, and may also help everyone work towards inclusion of the community even more. So those are our recommendations. They're actually outlined more in the report that we have. And now that I have shared the key insights of our report with you, I do invite you to check out the full comprehensive report, which is now available on our website. You can navigate to it, sinistrat.com, but you can also check out this bit.ly/LGBTQ report 2023. It should be there, available for your free download now. And I talked a bit about the greatest hits or the key insights, the key recommendations that we have from our report, but there's really more detailed discussion that you'll find in this big boy chunk of a report. So there, with that, I close this part of the discussion, and I really look forward to how our reactors will add their insights to what we've shared with you today. And we'll have an open forum after that. So thank you very much for listening to me this afternoon. I will turn the floor over to Alois.
Thank you, Mint, for sharing the 2023 LGBTQ plus Inclusion Online Discourse Report. It was a detailed report and rich discussion backed by data. And of course, as most of our attendees are part of the LGBT community or part of the members of organizations, there's already awareness on these issues, but this report shows us the magnitude of the discourse, which is very important, especially for campaigners or advocacy people. Very interesting as well that we have this report which covered several facets of the LGBTQ plus life, from visibility, economic well-being, and the lack of stories about it, relationships, health, and personal security and violence. Indeed, this is a painful, sometimes triggering, but necessary conversation. Let's now move on to our reactors. Our first reactor is Ms. Lacan Umali. Lacan is a writer based in Metro Manila. Her work has been published in Kritika Kultura, Soft Blow, and Likhaan, the Journal of Contemporary Philippine Literature. She placed first in the English division of the 2017 Maningning Miklat Poetry Competition and received an honorable mention at the first Kokoy F. Guevara Poetry Competition. As a UP instructor, she teaches world literature and writing. Lacan, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alois, and thank you so much, Mint, for that incredibly comprehensive and well-researched report. I'm glad that there are companies and organizations like Sin and Strat to be able to create data, to be able to create insight, which is backed on data, to be able to really explore the situation that many LGBTQ people face, not just online, but also offline. It's kind of disheartening that even if it's 2023, there's still a lot of very toxic, very negative discourse surrounding LGBTQ people. I know that sometimes it does seem a little abstract, no, that there are 41%, there are 41% of comments are negative, or that they're exclusionary or toxic. But I think it's also important for us to remember that the LGBTQ people that we talk about are also real people like me, and that these things, which might seem a little abstract or a bit difficult to grasp, are things which do affect us on a day-to-day basis. They might not be targeted at us, but imagine if you were like a 14-year-old trans girl who sees all of these comments on someone's murder, which don't express sympathy, but which instead express hate. Or you see an article about Vice Ganda and Ayon Perez, you see all of these comments and thoughts from people about how a family can't be LGBTQ, a family can't be open. So it's kind of scary, which still contributes to the feeling of a lot of people that they can come out, that they can be who they want to be. And like what Blanca Evangelista said in Pose, the TV show Pose, the greatest tragedy a person can experience is not become who they are. And to become who you are really is an important and a holistic part of human of being a human. Now, when I transitioned, I came into a part of myself. I became much more whole. I became much more in tune with who I was. I wasn't distracting myself anymore with things like work or academics to be able to ignore that really core truth in my existence. And fortunately, I have a very important support system. I have a very good support system. My family, my friends have all been so supportive, which has led the transition process to being something that's incredibly fruitful to me. But most trans people, especially in the Philippines, don't have that privilege and don't have that kind of supportive environment. And it's just tragic that they end up being stunted as people, they end up living as someone that they don't want to be. And this incredibly toxic and inhospitable environment in cyberspace, I think contributes. I think contributes to this. I don't know if the people who comment, all those negative things about the woman in the Zara, in the Zara changing room, or about how schools should not allow trans students to dress how they want. I wonder if they know that their comments have a tangible effect on people's lives and preventing people from being who they truly want to be. But it's still very much scary to be a trans person right now in the Philippines, to be LGBTQ in the Philippines. Like what Mint mentioned, the SOGI bill is still languishing in the parliamentary chambers. We have things like the Maharlika Investment Fund, which are being rushed because those are the priorities of the current administration. We have these important bills like the SOGI SC bill that have been languishing and stagnating in Congress and Senate for years, and which would, if they were passed, they would offer tangible protection for the lives of LGBTQ people. I remember one of the worries I had when I was about to transition was that if I apply for a job, if I apply for a job, would my workplace allow me to dress according to how I want to dress? Thankfully, I work in UP. It's a very supportive, it's a very open environment. But again, not all LGBTQ people have that. Okay. And unfortunately, there really are very little, there are very little legislative or official tools that LGBTQ people can use to be able to arm themselves, to protect themselves from discrimination, from harm. And as we've seen in the presentation, even, in the worst cases, it's kind of sad that sometimes it takes an LGBTQ people to be murdered for people to have some kind of sympathy for them, which shouldn't be the case. No, an LGBTQ people shouldn't have to die for someone to respect or to sympathize with them. It should be something that we should be given. It should be something that we be given, that we be understood. Not just as these tragic figures that live in the margin society, but as productive, as whole, as complex people that live, in society. It's interesting that I think Mint mentioned how a lot of some of the comments, oftentimes the positive comments occur when the trans person fits according to the cis definition of appearance. So if a trans woman looks like a cis woman, or a trans man looks like a cis man, which I think also shows the unfair standards we have for trans people when it comes to appearance and beauty. I think I've said this before, but when we think about what a woman looks like, not all women look the same. There are tall women, there are short women, there are women with small breasts, there are women with narrow hips, there are women who are very slim, there are women who are chubby. So to insist that trans women have to abide by a certain kind of appearance is also limiting, I think, to cis women, because it presumes that there's only one way to be a woman when there are many ways to be a woman. And it's also unfair because to transition the Philippines, it's very difficult. There's the constant passing where you quote unquote pass like a real woman. And oftentimes it does take some medical transitioning. Now, which is, supposedly, ideally, to transition medically, it should be a form of healthcare. It should be a human right that all trans people have access to. However, it's not the case right now in the Philippines. There are very few doctors and endocrinologists who are equipped with dealing with trans people who want to transition. No, thankfully, I was able to go to Love Yourself, the NGO, because they have a trans healthcare clinic. But the tests I had to take to ensure that it was safe for me to medically transition, it was very expensive. I think around 5,000 pesos for one set of tests and 5,000 pesos for another set of tests. So thankfully, I'm lucky that I have resources. But if you're a working class trans woman, for example, I don't think being able to afford it as easily. And it's necessary for you to ensure that your body can take the hormones that you want to take. But those tests aren't available to the majority of Filipinos. And also, for example, when it comes to hormones, a lot of the hormones which trans people need aren't carried by local drugstores, which is kind of strange because cis people also need these hormones. For example, postmenopausal women also need progesterone or estrogen, but so many drugstores don't carry them. So a lot of trans people, including me, have to go to more unofficial sources. To go to more unofficial sources to be able to get the medicine that we need. I mean, even the ones who, even the older trans women who've been transitioning for the longest time, they tell us that they get the sources from the same kinds of people. And these are not the accredited, formally accredited people, but, we have no choice because there is no other way to get them. Healthcare in the Philippines is already terrible. What more trans healthcare? It's kind of heartening that, there are more positive comments when it comes to LGBTQ people online. I remember last year the presentation was kind of a bit wholly negative. It was a bit more negative if I recall the Sin and Strat presentation last year. Growing up, I don't think I ever saw any kind of coverage towards people like Vice Ganda and Ion Perez. And even though the media coverage is really concentrated on, Vice Ganda and Ion Perez or on drag queens, I do think it's very important that there is more coverage and that there's more representation. I think it's important, especially in the case of Vice Ganda and Ion Perez, to show that there are fruitful and productive LGBTQ relationships that, for example, a straight identifying or at least a cis identifying man like Ion would fall for someone like Vice. Remember, in a lot of interviews, Vice would be asked, what if Ion leaves you for a quote unquote real woman? And the love of Ion would just be something that would be very palpable in never leaving Vice. So it's good that there are those kinds of alternative narratives that are present when it comes to being LGBTQ. Because when I was growing up, it was really, the bakla would pay for a boyfriend, and then after a few months, the boyfriend would leave the bakla for a real woman, or the bakla would get an STD and die, or the bakla would be a victim of a hate crime. So it's really good that there are much more positive narratives. However, I think that it's also good that Mint and the company pointed out that the prevalence still of all of these toxic and vicious comments. If I recall correctly, something that really struck me recently was the controversy around Luca Vega, the drag queen who had done that Ama Namin parody dressed as Jesus. And I was just surprised. Not just at the viciousness of both at the viciousness of the comments. I was surprised that numerous cities were declaring him persona non grata. I was surprised that he is now suffering. He now has to face a court case, which is a completely disproportionate and exorbitant response to what is basically an artistic performance. Which shows again the priority of our current political system, that they would rather penalize drag performance rather than clamp down on the rampant EJKs, corruption, and cultural impunity present in our country right now. But I was also kind of surprised that the response to Puro Lucas' performance was also negative, even among people I would think are more liberal allies. I oftentimes saw those comments that that Puro Lucas should tone it down, that Puro Lucas should find more palatable means of doing his art, that was Pura Lucas' fault, that being declared persona non grata was Pura Lucas' fault because it alienated possible Catholic allies, which for me speaks of the fact that, even seeming allies, they still have this idea that being LGBTQ means abiding by certain standards which are set by a very heteronormative, standards which are set by a very straight, by a very heterosexual culture. Okay, so I'm glad that Strat has these very comprehensive reports every year to be able to tell us about the digital landscape. I think it's a very good tool for not just media practitioners, not just for journalists, but really anyone who goes on the internet and who has to face all of this negativity, who has to face all of this toxicity. And I'm glad that there is actual data that backs up the experience of being LGBTQ online. And I hope that people actually listen to Sin and Strat because the report has a number of great insights and not just great insights, but very doable, very practical steps forward to be able to make Philippine cyberspace and also Philippine society much more LGBTQ inclusive. So thank you very much. I'll give the floor back to Alois.
Hello, yeah. Thank you so much, Lakana. We're glad to hear your thoughts on this report, especially as a writer, as a teacher, and definitely you shape the minds of the younger generation, the generation who's going to be more exposed to online culture. So we thank you for your very, very insightful and realistic and very on the ground sharing with us here at the webinar. Right now, we're going to present our second reactor, Mr. Save Gregorio. Save is a journalist who has covered various assignments, including politics, diplomacy, gender, and sexuality. Some of his coverage has been lauded by the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility. He's also a recipient of the special citation during the 17th Gandingan Awards. Save, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I want to jump off from Lacan's point, about LGBTQ plus people being people. I think that's something that needs to be emphasized more coming by the media. I'll talk about more of that later. But first, let me thank Sinistrat for having this kind of data-driven research that is quite needed by policymakers as well as journalists as well as pretty much everyone, sabi nga nila Kan, na para ma-enlighten ang mga tao tungkol sa LGBTQ plus issues dito sa Pilipinas. There's not much research really on LGBTQ plus people and attitudes toward LGBTQ plus people. The most recent one prior to this, if I recall correctly, was the SWS survey on trustworthiness of LGBTQ plus Filipinos, which is an interesting metric to measure, to say the least. But anyway, I like to jump into the report na, no? Napansin ko na it appears that there's a changing attitude kasi like nakita natin na mas madami daw love reacts ngayon compared to the previous report. But I would like to point out na most of like the report pointed out then, no, most of this actually came from Vice Ganda reports, right? Which leads me to discuss intersectionality. So there are class issues at play here. So Vice Ganda and Ion Perez surrogacy, yung narrative doon, dominant narrative doon is about pera, that it's their choice because it's their money, it's their choice. So lumilitaw yung class issues natin. And then ilagay pa natin doon yung lack of economic well-being stories, which is a blind spot in coverage. Of course, there is, I guess, not a lot of appetite to explore those kinds of stories, but that's an opportunity for media to really come in and do people stories, tawag namin people stories, na you discuss an issue from the lens of people experiencing these kinds of issues because mas maging tangible. Hindi lang kami data point, hindi lang kami basta statistic, tao kami. diba? So, moving on to another point, yung lack of discussions on gender-based violence is actually may be produced by the police force itself. There may be a tendency for the police to actually neglect the link between victims of GSC. And that may be a narrative that may be produced and just parroted by the media. So there is a need for the media to interrogate these official narratives. There's also a need for more GSC education among Filipinos, as recommended by the research and as evidenced by the research then, no? Going back to Lacan's point, I think there's a need really to show LGBTQ plus people are people too. So media should frame the SOGSC bill as people stories. Again, show how the SOGSC bill can positively impact people. Paano to makakatulong sa pang-araw-araw na buhay ng mga bading, tomboy, lesbiana, trans people, everyone in between the gender spectrum, even straight people perhaps. How could this possibly impact them? So, and then ipakita nyo din ipakita din natin how its absence can negatively impact people. Moving on to the next point. So some of the online reactions, or actually maybe a lot of the online reactions to LGBTQ plus issues is, sabi nga din ni Lacan, is a symptom of heteronormativity and heteropatriarchy, which is still prevalent in Philippine society. And media, of course, tend to produce this dominant narrative. Under this, there's a premium put on passing for trans people, passing as real women, real men, or real men, whatever that is, real women. Their personhood is reduced to their performance of heteronormative expectations. Again, dehumanizing yun. So kailangan for media, for communicators also to present LGBTQ plus people, to present trans people as people. May na-mention si Mint about universal values as entry point to LGBTQ plus inclusion. Yes, I agree to a certain extent. I guess ang framing ko dito, ang take ko dito is that media should emphasize that LGBTQ plus issues are human rights issues. Yun nga, LGBTQ plus people are people too. So under human rights also, one of our fundamental human rights is enshrined in our constitution is the freedom of religion. Media should also discuss freedom from religion, challenge that narrative, that dominant narrative, that freedom of religion, freedom of religion means necessarily imposing your religion onto other people. Because what about other minorities, right? We have to tell people that your following your religion doesn't restrict me, it restricts you. But there's a caveat there. Yung universal values as an entry point, I think it turns sour when there is an expectation to follow these rules. For LGBTQ plus people to be accepted, they have to follow these rules. Again, jumping out from Lacan's point on Pura Luca Vega, the reaction is so disproportionate for an act of free expression, for an act of artistic expression. And there is an expectation for LGBTQ plus people to be accepted. They have to abide the rules, which are set again by heteropatriarchy, heteronormativity, and even the church, the Judeo-Christian thought, Judeo-Christian ideologies. But again, another but, about human rights issues, there's really not much appetite, I think, for human rights issues coverage, because human rights has been largely demonized by the previous administration. So there's not much appetite for it, because human rights has been misconstrued rather as support for drug addicts or support for criminals. And that's no thanks to the past administration, which really deteriorated most of our institutions. There's also no appetite to challenge dominant ideologies, like for example, Judeo-Christian thought. And that just goes to speak about our media landscape. There is a need really to diversify media workers and for more people to enter the media industry with diverse backgrounds, diverse SOGSCs, diverse class backgrounds, so that we have more comprehensive, nuanced coverage. So another point about HIV, about the HIV epidemic here in the Philippines, which is one of the worst in the world. I think it boils down to a lack of two, sorry, one, two, three, four things. So una-una, lack of health and science communications from health authorities themselves. It's emblematic of the government's lack of attention to the issue for so long. Um, we have yet to see a shift in this policy, although Marcos Jr. has said he wants to prioritize the HIV epidemic. He has given that directive to the DOH. He was, to his credit, the first president to mention HIV in a State of the Nation address, but we have yet to see him walk the talk. There's a lack of attention from the media because partly because of the lack of diversities in the newsrooms, like I said. There's a lack of appetite for health news in general from the public because unless it's an emerging infectious disease like monkeypox, which is controversial, which is maybe salacious, it doesn't get enough coverage. And then health advice also, unless it's health advice like, Salamat Doc or Doc Willie Ong or your other doctor influencers on social media, it doesn't really get much attention. And of course, lack of staff. There's really, again, because newsrooms prioritize news and information that has more interactions, more engagements, more clicks. Since health news doesn't get really much clicks, it gets funneled, it gets buried to the bottom of the news agenda. So because that's the case, it's unlikely that they would actually dedicate staff to cover health in general. About visibility stories, it's the report said 90.3% of the whole sample tackled visibility stories. But we have to ask, who is visible really? The report showed that most of the people who are visible are actually celebrities, entertainment personalities. But we need more coverage of gender and sexuality in the Philippines that is beyond celebrities, beyond narratives that only celebrate LGBTQ plus people and for their achievements. But caveat ulit doon, no? Filipinos really like entertainment content more than news content, which serves a niche audience, really. So, kailangan ng journalists, ang media should find a right balance between entertainment and news value and find that sweet spot where pwedeng umentrada ang LGBTQ plus issues and LGBTQ plus inclusion. Siguro babalikan ko ulit yung point namin ni Lacan pareho na kailangan i-emphasize natin that LGBTQ plus people are people. And that should be seen in our stories, the way that we tell our stories, and the way that we cover LGBTQ plus issues. Again, we are not just data points. We are people who experience real life harm, real life discrimination, real life death, killings even. So, kailangan mapukpok yon sa consciousness ng bawat Pilipino at bawat tao dito na tao ang pinag-uusapan natin. At dahil tao kami, meron kaming mga karapatan na dapat pinoprotektahan, hindi lang ng Estado, pinoprotektahan ng bawat isa. Yun, maraming salamat sa oras. Alam ko medyo hardcore, baka medyo na pa-hardcore yung aking discussion. Pero maraming salamat sa oras at balik ko ang floor kay Alois. Thank you.
Thank you, Save. That's yung insights that you provided are valuable, especially from the perspective of a journalist who has covered issues affecting the LGBTQ plus community. Thank you, Save.